today is from Romans chapter 3, and verses 9 to 20. Paul is speaking. No one is righteous. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. For we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, if you have your Bible, then please do turn back to Romans 3. As I often have said, it's always a good idea to have a Bible in front of you. If you don't have your own with you, then there's still some on the windowsills that you can grab and use as we look at this text together. So we're in Romans chapter 3, and when we had the reading, that's from verse 9 right until verse 20. We should really just come to God in prayer before we just examine this further. Let's pray. Father, thank you that we have this precious word. Lord, we repeat that sentence so many times because it is always true. And Lord, in truth, we are not thankful enough that we have your word. Lord, what an amazing thing it is that the God of the universe, the God who is so much greater than we could ever imagine, has truly spoken so that we would hear your voice. And not only have you spoken for us, but what you say reflects your love for us and how in Jesus Christ you have shown that love so beautifully and so completely. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your care. And Lord, knowing that care, we know that as we open your word now together, oh Lord, as we pray for you and your guidance and your help for our understanding, Lord, we know that this is a prayer that reflects your will for us, that we should know you more through your word. So Lord, as it is preached, Lord, we pray that the words of this preacher would truly reflect your words in the Bible. Lord, may that truth really speak to us, speak to our hearts, challenge us, encourage us, and change us for your glory. Amen. Now, I don't know if this is true, because I've never seen it written down anywhere. Some time ago, I tried to look up this, but I remember being told something about John Wesley, the evangelist in the 18th century, that if he was ever going to be preaching somewhere for 5 days, he would spend 4.5 days speaking on our sinfulness in God's wrath, and then at the end spend half a day speaking about how we can be saved by the Lord Jesus through his death on the cross. 4.5 days on our background situation, and then a final half day on the wonderful work of salvation. As I said, I don't know if that's really true, but it certainly does reflect something of what John Wesley understood. That before you get to the good news of the gospel, you do need to help people understand their current situation And sometimes you will need to spend more time on the current situation because people are so reluctant to really take in what God has shown us of our spiritual need. Because if we don't understand the bad news, well, the good news will not really seem all that good. And that's the problem, dare I say, with a lot of evangelism today, where Christians would rather avoid telling others about sin and punishment because it's uncomfortable to tell people that they have failed. It's uncomfortable to tell people about the reality of God's wrath and the reality of hell. But of course, not only did John Wesley understand it was important to lay this out, but when we look in the Bible, we see him very clearly as well, don't we? We see that Jesus spoke an awful lot about hell. And when we look in the book that we're looking at the moment, the book of Romans, we see a significant emphasis on our sinfulness and God's wrath. Now, we did have a break from this series over Christmas. But it's interesting just to mention that the last time we had a passage from Romans that isn't mostly about how sinful we are, is back on the 3rd of November. So when we've been in Romans since then, we've been looking at how Paul is really just trying to explore this reality of our background. All the way from chapter 1 verse 18 to the end of today's passage, the theme has been God's wrath and our sinfulness. That's about 2 chapters worth of verses, pretty much just setting out the background for the good news, which, of course, as we continue in Romans, will be so beautifully expressed. But today's passage, there's a feel of all that Paul's been saying about our background being brought together, ready for what will follow, which means that once again, the focus for today is on our sin. And it is so that we can really grasp our condition without Christ, so that we may see even more clearly how amazing it is that the grace of God has been shown to us. So, our big title for this morning is No One is Righteous. And as we explore these verses which speak about our sin, our first point is the extent of our sin. Verses 9 to 12, the extent of sin, or the extent of our sin, as in how wide is the extent of sin. Who is affected by sin? Is it most people? Is it lots of people? Well, no, of course, we know the answer. The answer is everyone. Everyone is affected by sin. Everyone, whoever you are, whatever your background. Whether you're man or woman. Whatever your status might be. Whatever your level of intelligence might be. Whatever social class you might feel that you fit in, if that really makes any difference in anything anymore. Whatever ethnicity. No one is better. Even the Jews. Verse 9 spells this out. What shall we conclude then, says Paul? Are we any better? And he says, not at all. Now, it's important that Paul re-emphasises what he's been saying at the end of chapter 2, that the Jews are not in a better kind of condition. Because in between that, in the first part of chapter 3, Paul has been spelling out the advantages, or some of the advantages that there would be for the Jews, particularly the fact that they had the Word of God. Does that qualify them as being better in any way? They heard more of the truth about God, but does that give them even a partial salvation? And of course the answer is no. Paul has said that the Jews have an advantage because they've had the Word of God, but that doesn't make them any better than anyone else in terms of righteousness. And so he says, are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that the Jews and Gentiles are alike, are all under sin. And then Paul continues by quoting from a few passages in the Old Testament to show that God's wrath has already shown everyone to be guilty. And we get verses 10 to 12, which is a quotation from Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, which are very close. And it describes our natural state. In other words, without God's intervention, this is how we are. Verse 10, there is no one righteous, not even one. In our natural state, no one meets the perfect standard. No one is righteous. Verse 11, there is no one who understands. We don't get it in our natural state. We don't understand either the need of salvation or how it comes about. And I wonder whether you've seen that when you've chatted to non-Christian friends. Do you sometimes get exasperated when non-Christians just don't seem to understand the simple gospel message? For us who have believed, it makes so much sense, but when you try and understand it without faith, it doesn't work. And verse 11 continues, it says, no one who understands, no one who seeks God. See, without God already moving in us, nobody seeks God. That's what this verse says. Now, we could kind of counter that and say, well, surely the Bible shows us that people do seek God. For example, there's a wonderful verse that we may have learnt. Jeremiah 29 verse 13, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. People are seeking God, aren't they? Well, actually that verse really proves the point. What happens when someone seeks God with all their heart? They find Him. So why have not everyone found Him? Because not everyone is seeking God. In fact, we need the Holy Spirit to awaken our soul to start searching. When people talk about a God-shaped hole in our lives, and maybe it's not the best and most helpful always way to talk about our need of God, but yeah, I think it's okay. There is a need for God, isn't there? And people are trying to fill that need, but are they seeking God to fill it? Well, no. They seek religion of all kinds. They seek a God in their own image. They seek after something, and a whole load of things that aren't anything remotely religious in terms of traditional sense. People try and fill their need for all kinds of things. But there is no one who understands, no one who seeks after God. Verse 12, all have turned away, and we know the verse from Isaiah 53, all like sheep have gone astray, turned each one to his own way. It goes on, all have turned away, they have together become worthless. And later I want to return to that word worthless. But it continues saying that there is no one who does good, not even one. Again, some people might object to that. No one who does good. I mean, there's so many good things in this world, aren't there? Not just done by Christians. I don't think this means that there is nothing good at all that can come from a non-Christian. See, we've been made in the image of God, and there are many beautiful things that are done by non-Christians, including amazing acts of kindness. And yet none of them are truly good. They are all tainted by our sinfulness in all kinds of ways. And Isaiah chapter 64 verse 6 speaks about our good deeds being like a polluted garment, or a filthy rag, or maybe a more literal translation is a minstrel cloth. That is what our good deeds are described as in Isaiah 64. See, God looks down on mankind and sees that there is no one who's righteous, no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away, become worthless. There is no one who does good. This is quoting from Psalm 14, where we also read the expression that the Lord looks down from heaven on the sons of men. That's not repeated in the quote in Romans 3. But when you hear that expression, the Lord looks down from heaven on the sons of men, I wonder if that reminds you of anything. It reminded me when I read it of actually a story that the children's talk touched on. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 8, where we're introduced to what's about to follow. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals and the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have ever made. That's what we read in Genesis 6, when God looks down on the human race, on the earth that he created. And in Psalm 14, and echoed again here in Romans 3, the Lord looks down and he sees that same picture of sinfulness. And yet, of course, in Genesis 6, the very next verse points to something which is suddenly gives us hope. God says, I regret that I have made them, verse 8, but Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. You see, even there, as the Lord looks down and sees such evil, we see such beautiful grace in the heart of God. And as he looked down with grace, even then, as we read here in Romans 3 about this condition of mankind without God, we know that it comes as a pointer to the grace of God who looks down. And because of his will, his purposes, and his favour for those like us who trust in Jesus. So, the extent of sin is everywhere. Every person, every place. But secondly, the depth of sin. Verses 13 to 18, the depth of sin. And Paul continues quoting from the Old Testament. This time he's going down a few different places. And I think there's three ways that these quotes illustrate what we are like in our sin. Firstly, he speaks about the sin in our words. The sin in our words. So verse 13, the first part of it, their throats are open graves, and their tongues practice deceit. That's a quote from Psalm 5, where David is speaking. He's speaking about his enemies. David's enemies, David says their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. Here Paul is using that description to describe all people, including God's own people, reflecting the reality that we are all enemies. The next part of the verse, the poison of vipers is on their lips. That quotes from Psalm 140. And again there, David is speaking about his enemies. And now it's applied to all people. Verse 14 quotes from Psalm 10 and verse 7. We read verse 14, their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Psalm 10 speaks of the destruction of the wicked. And Paul quotes that to further illustrate this sin that we have in our words. And when we pull all these descriptions that Paul is using, quoting from the Old Testament together, we see that our words, the words of sinful man, are deadly, deceitful, they're poisonous or weakening, they're cursing, they are bitter. Our words are deadly, they are deceitful, they are poisonous, they are cursing, they are bitter. If we will compare that to the Word of God. The Word of God is declared to be many things, isn't it? And actually, among the things that we read about the Word of God, the opposite of all those things is true, isn't it? See, God's Word is not deadly He has the words of life. God's words are not deceitful. He has the words of truth. God's words are not poisonous. They're not weakening. God's word strengthens. God's word is not cursing. His words are those who are blessed. And God's word is not bitter. God's word is sweet. But without God, we are the opposite. Our words are deadly, deceitful, poisonous, they're cursing, they're bitter. So we have the sin in our words, but as Paul moves on, we see the sin in our actions, verses 15 to 17. The sin in our actions. And these verses are a quote from Isaiah 59, where we read this condemnation of Israel. And Paul quotes saying, their feet are swift to shed blood. This is a description of Israel. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now, in the context of Isaiah 59, it's interesting that this comes after in the same chapter, verse 2, Isaiah 59, verse 2, where God has said about the effect of their sin, your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. You see, that's the effect of sin. It separates us from God. And so this description of people without God reflects our condition as separate from God. Now this quote from verses 15 to 18 or to 17 also reflects verses from Proverbs. Verse 15 is actually, as well as being quoted from Isaiah 59, reflects almost the same from Proverbs chapter 1, verse 16. And verses 16 and 17 here. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There's actually something written in Proverbs chapter 3 that marks the opposite of that, where it says that of wisdom, her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. See, these ways of man without God are the ways that are opposite the way of wisdom, and ways that reflect a separation from God. So we see here in these verses the sin in our words, the sin in our actions, and also the sin in our wills. Verse 18, the sin in our wills. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And this is a quote from Psalm 36, where it says, transgression speaks to the ungodly within his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. And note how it continues. This is from Psalm 36, where Paul is quoting from. And by the way, when we read little quotes from the Old Testament here, we probably don't immediately think of the verses that follow. But in an age where there was so much less information, and an age where there had been, certainly for the Jewish readers, a very strong discipline in learning Scripture, it's very probable that many readers or listeners to this would immediately know what follows, and immediately be able to start relating to it. This is what follows from that sentence in Psalm 36, that there is no fear of God before their eyes. What is in their eyes? Well, verse 2 says, for it flatters him in his own eyes, concerning the discovery of his iniquity and hatred of it. In other words, he hides the problem and flatters himself, looks to himself, and the effect is then spelled out in verse 3, the words of his mouth are wickedness and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and to do good. See, when we turn our eyes from God and look to ourselves and flatter ourselves and try and kill ourselves, the effect is that we sin in our words and deeds. The words of his mouth, the psalmist says, are wickedness and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and to do good. Words, actions reflected the reality of our hearts. So what does the testimony of Scripture say in terms of our depth of sin? Well, it says we are all sinners and that we are sinful to the core. We have sins of the mouth, We have sins of our arms and legs, our actions, that all reflect that we have rejected God. So, the extent of sin is everywhere, the depth of sin is so deep. Thirdly, the knowledge of sin. The knowledge of sin, verses 19 and 20, the knowledge of sin. See, it's easy for a Jew to conclude that a Gentile is guilty. They're automatically guilty. They're outside the will of God, if you have the Jewish mindset in the first century, as Paul is speaking. But listen to verse 19. Now, we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. What is Paul arguing here? He's saying that he's been showing that even the Jews will be held accountable to God for their sin. And if even the Jews are, then the whole world. See, the previous descriptions of quotations have been used to describe those who are under the law. So some of those in the Psalms were written about the enemies of David, and yet Paul is saying that this is also about each one of us. And thus, if even Jews who have the law are guilty, then every mouth may be silenced. There's no excuses. Every mouth may be silenced. If you compare that to the kind of excuses that you hear, I mean, children making excuses, I guess, is classic. The kind of, you want to get out of trouble, so you kind of blame it on someone else. He started it, she started it, she said this, he did it first. It wasn't me, even. Classic excuse for teachers. I don't know if it ever is really used, but the dog ate my homework. Or anything that will shift the blame from yourself to somebody else. Well, children do it, don't they? We all do it in maybe more subtle ways. But God says this: every mouth may be silenced. No excuses anymore. See, the whole world be held accountable to God for their sin. There is no excuse. The Jews had the law and a whole word of God. And Paul has shown how the Gentiles have had the witness of God in creation. They've had the law in their consciences. The whole world is held accountable to God. Therefore, says Paul in verse 20, therefore no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. This therefore, I think, is kind of drawn together, not just this one train of thought, not just this one passage, but the whole argument of the last couple of chapters. And it concludes that no one can be declared righteous through observing the law or through anything we do. And rather, and he gets on really to what the point of the law is, the most significant thing in terms of what it teaches us, is this, verse 20, rather through the law we become conscious of sin. You see, because the law sets out righteousness, it shows us what we are like in comparison. It is like a mirror that shows who we really are. But why is that good? Why is it good to see what we're really like? Because let's face it, people don't particularly like seeing how they really are. Once upon a time, I'm sure, those mirrors that kind of wobble and make you look different, particularly mirrors that will make you look thinner, they would be more like how you'd like to be seen, but bringing it more up to date. When people take selfies on their phones. So many people, I think it's automatically built into some of the software to make your skin look smoother and your eyes look bigger and the face looks narrower. And so many people, as they post photos of themselves on social media, have these effects on their photos. Why? Because they don't want people to see what they really look like. They want this kind of smoothed down version of themselves, a more satisfying version of themselves. They don't want people to see what they really look like. And when it comes to the way that the Bible portrays us, very often we don't want to see what we look like. And so why has Paul been labouring for 2 chapters to set out how we really appear? Is it just to make us feel bad? Is it just to rack us with guilt? Is it to punish us with that feeling of guilt because we're such rotten sinners? Why has Paul focused on this? You see, he keeps pointing back to the law, and the law in the Old Testament shows us what we look like, but Paul's been spending 2 chapters just really fleshing out how that really means that we look and how awful we look. I've got a slide which I've prepared for. I was going to do the whole of the 2 chapters, but I could only fit in enough words from chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. These are some of the words that Paul is using to describe mankind. You know, words like deceit and death and impurity, envy, dark and strife, shameful, unnatural, ruthless. You can read more words yourself. There's so many awful words that give this horrible picture of who we are. It's not a very pleasant portrait, is it? If someone was to draw you a portrait, and this is what they came up with, you wouldn't be too impressed, would you? Well, we've come to the end of the passage. But I want to just sneak into the next passage. Because we've seen in these verses, we've seen the extent of sin. We've seen the depth of sin. We've seen the knowledge of sin that comes with the law. There's a 4th point I just want to focus on before we just close. And it's the word but. Verse 21, into next time's passage. But. You see, why are we given this horrible portrait of who we are? Well, we've already seen hints of the answer. But as we sneak into this next passage, we see a little more. And I'm just using that one word that verse 21 starts with, the word but. See, we've been given this horrible portrait of humanity, and it is horrific. And it may make us feel awful about ourselves, and I can imagine that some people would come up with the objection that this would be just right to give people a low self-esteem. And we don't want people to have a low self-esteem. We don't want to hear that message that you're all rotten sinners, especially with that word in verse 12, worthless. What a horrible word it is, worthless. But why are we snuck into verse 21? It's because the word but starts to turn everything around. Because although we cannot find anything good about ourselves, as we continue through this book, we discover that we are more loved than we could ever imagine. And that although we don't deserve it, we are not worthless to God. We are very highly valued. Let me just show you as a kind of closing illustration a few paintings that I came across online. Isn't that a marvellous masterpiece? Who thinks they could do that? Yeah. Well, some people do put their hand up. If you give them the right materials, I'm sure, 3 lines, 2 colours. It's amazing. How about this one? Blue canvas with a white line going down. No. Could be a good design for clothes. I don't know, it's not that clever, is it? Another liney kind of drawing or painting. And another. This is a bit more kind of smudgy, I suppose. Do you think they're really wonderful pieces to look at? I don't know. I mean, some people must love them, but I don't know. I look at that and think, that doesn't really impress me very much. But what makes any painting like these paintings, what gives them any worth? I guess it's a combination of things, isn't it? Who made them? That will change their value a little. What the purpose was, why they made them, and most significantly, what someone was willing to pay for them. So these very basic, in my opinion, not very clever pieces of art, this is how much they've been sold for. That's $46.5 million. That's $43.8 million. That's $84.2 million. And that one's $86.9 million. Well, here's a portrait of us. Even worse than those paintings. What's the value of us? Well, kind of follows the same criteria, I guess, to an extent. Actually, the fact that God made us, that gives us great worth. What was the purpose for us? It was to bring glory to Him. And that's some work, isn't it? And how much was someone willing to pay for us? There's the answer to us. How much are you worth? We aren't defined by our sinfulness, thankfully, because God in His grace has shown us how much we are worth. You've seen this kind of illustration maybe before, but if God was measuring how much we're worth with His arms, what would He do? Would He say that we're worth that much? Would He say that we're worth that much? Would He say that He's worth that much? He died on the cross for us. And He died on the cross, even though we are rotten sinners, even though in our own right we're worthless, because He has set that value on us. It is so precious. I wonder this morning, have you put your trust in the Lord Jesus? Have you recognized that you are a sinner? Have you recognized that there is nothing you can do to stop yourself being that sinner, to remove that guilt from you? Have you recognized that? But have you seen that the Lord Jesus has shown just how much you are worth to Him by dying on the cross, by bearing your sins and shame? Have you put your trust in Jesus? If you haven't, then please do so today. There will be a couple of people down at the front at the end as ever to pray with anyone who wants praying with. And please, if that's true for you, if you have not yet done that, then please speak to them or speak to me or anyone that you know is a Christian about doing that today. And I'm sure most of us have put our trust in Jesus. Maybe all of us, I don't know. As we consider just who we are in our own right and what Christ has done for us, let us be even more glad and more joyful and more willing to give our whole lives to Him who loved us so greatly. Let's pray. Father God, thank you that even though we look worse than a pretty rubbish painting, we are worth far more than those paintings ever fetched. Lord, there is no money that could be used to illustrate how much we are worth. Thank you that in the cross we see the best way of seeing that measure. You love us so much. Praise you, God. So sorry for our sins. Thank you that in Christ we have forgiveness, we have new life, we have reconciliation to you, we have adoption into your family, we have eternal life. We have that wonderful eternity of glory to look forward to. Thank you, Lord. Praise your name.